I think it was sort of the megalomaniac project.
My name is Andrew Nielsen. I am Director of Campaigns at the Howard League for Penal Reform, which, as you've heard, is a very old and august institution. My own interest in this, other than the fact that I work for the Howard League, is that I live between Tottenham and Wood Green, so I was walking on a Sunday night by a police helicopter above my house, which was very interesting. And also in August, in the aftermath of some of the cases going through the courts, I made the mistake of giving a quote saying that I felt that the sentences were too harsh, and I received a lot of media attention for that, and a lot of hate mail, which I've kept in a special folder. However, I want to just say a little bit about the riots and the aftermath of the riots, and particularly from my perspective, which is the world of criminal justice prisons. We know the courts were instructed to consider involvement in the public disturbances as an aggravating factor when sentencing. And in a sense, we recognise, I think, at the Howard League that the courts were expected to respond quickly. There was a lot of public unrest and disquiet about what was going on. And particularly, I think, on the Monday evening, there was a lot of fear on the streets, and I think we should acknowledge that. So the idea that the courts were going to move swiftly to be seen to be doing justice, I think, was in some ways understandable. However, there is a key principle of law which we feel kind of fell out of the equation, and that is proportionality, the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. And one of our main concerns is that in the rush to justice, we have lost that principle of proportionality. 6 months in prison for stealing a £3.50 case of bottled water is not proportionality. The single mother sentenced to 5 months in prison for handling stolen goods when she was actually asleep during the riots did not receive a proportionate sentence, particularly when you bear in mind that even 5 months in prison would be long enough for that woman to potentially lose her children and lose her home. 4 years in prison is a serious sentence, which might typically be the sorts of offences you might expect to get 4 years for would be GBH, some forms of sexual assault. 4 years in prison for drunkenly inciting a riot on Facebook, which didn't happen, which you took down when you sobered up in the morning as a post, certainly is a disproportionate sentence, and that was the case that I commented on in August. That case is now before the Court of Appeal, and we'll wait to see what happens with it. Whatever, the result has been unprecedented numbers of people in prison. Each week for the last 4 weeks, we've seen new record high prison populations in England and Wales. On the Friday before the riots, so that's August the 5th, there were 85,523 people in prison. Last Friday, on the 7th of October, there were 87,673 men, women and children in prison. That's an increase of over 2,000 in 9 weeks. I just want to run through some statistics. What do we know about the sentences? The latest official figures we have from the government date back to mid-September. We know that just over 1,700 people have been brought before the courts so far, and 18% have been found guilty and sentenced. Of those 1,700 odd before the courts, 1,149 were from London. So around 2/3 of the people before the courts and riot-related offences have been from London. The most common offence was burglary, followed by violent disorder, theft, and then a few robbery and criminal damage cases. You may have heard that a large majority of the adults brought to court were already known to the criminal justice system, which is a fact that has been used by various politicians for various ends. However, it's important to bear in mind that while 77% of adults had had a previous caution or conviction, the vast majority had, I think 38.7% of that group had had a reprimand or some form of breach or summary offence. So they were actually much less likely to have been convicted in the past for more serious offences. And indeed, those involved in the riots were actually more likely to be first-time offenders compared to people committing similar types of offences last year. 27% of those coming before the courts had no previous convictions in the riots. Last year, 23% of those committed sentenced for similar offences were first-timers. We know that rioters were far more likely to be remanded into custody by the courts. We know that the courts sentenced many more people than normal to immediate custody. So in 2010, for similar offences, if you were before a magistrate's court, 12% of people could expect to be sentenced to immediate custody. For those involved in the riots, that shot up to 43%. In the Crown courts, normally 33% would expect to be sentenced to immediate custody, and this shoots up to 89% for those convicted in the riots. Not only are you more likely to be sent to custody, but your average sentence length is significantly higher and more than doubled in the magistrate courts in response to the riots, and it was up almost 50% in the Crown courts. I want to just especially mention children and young people under the age of 18. Some of you may have seen a story in The Guardian today about the international children's charity UNICEF condemning the government and saying that the sentences and use of remand for children in response to the riots is in breach of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. 19% of those before the courts in London were under the age of 18, or children, so almost 1 in 5. I think children particularly suffered from this rush to justice because as signatories to the UN Convention, we are supposed to, and we uphold, supposedly, the principle that custody for children should be used as a last resort and for the shortest possible time. That was not happening. We know that because in 2010, just over 5% of children before the courts would be sentenced to custody. For those involved in the riots, it was over 26%. And in terms of remand, in terms of sending children who had not been convicted, who were innocent before being proven guilty, on average about 10% of children would normally be remanded into custody. In the aftermath of the riots, it was 40%, so a 4-fold increase. There was no sense that the courts were treating children as a distinctive group with their own vulnerabilities and needs. I just want to end very briefly on saying, what's the solution? Well, we'll hear about the solutions, or ideas for solutions tonight, hopefully. What I would say about the Howard League is we believe that if you want to solve crime, you have to solve the underlying causes of crime. The riots were not simply outbreaks of criminality, pure and simple, as politicians have been, including the Prime Minister, have described them. They are a symptom of issues that are best addressed by wider social policy. The answers do not lie within the criminal justice system. After all, successive governments since the mid-1990s have more than doubled the prison population in this country, and yet we still saw the worst street disturbances in our cities in many decades. Simply banging up more people and for longer is never the answer.
In a political capacity tonight, but I'm happy to answer any particular issues. I'm a councillor in Hackney, Queen's Ward, not far from here. Where shall I start? Well, we all can remember when the riots started, first in Tottenham, then Hackney and elsewhere. I'm a bit of a fraud because I was actually 4,000 miles away. I was actually in Jamaica at the time on holiday. But it was interesting to have an international perspective what happened during the riots, because watching the news coverage in Jamaica, watching all the major news channels, the way the riots were portrayed internationally was quite amazing. Firstly, it was portrayed purely as a race thing, race riots. And that's not to say that, obviously, initially a lot of young black people were involved in the riots, but obviously we all know that it crossed race, gender, ethnicity. But the way it was portrayed internationally, it was seen as black people just going amok. Very narrow negative. At the time, I was actually on national TV in Jamaica and Kingston, which is the equivalent of the Channel 4 News, because they wanted to have a diaspora effect. People wanted to know why were people rioting, what caused this. All they could see was a rolling film footage of the building, I think in Croydon, that was been burning all the time. But it gave the impression that the whole of Britain was alive, was on fire. You know, so this is the whole issue around the media, how it portrays stuff. And obviously, then the media kind of plays on colonial stereotypes about the perception of communities in Britain in city areas. So really my job at the time when I was interviewed was to try and dispel some of those myths, and obviously at that time everything happened immediately. But one of the things that we did do in terms of the Africa Trust as a national charity, we look at the health needs of minority communities in Britain, whether they're Chinese, Vietnamese, Turkish, African Caribbean, Gypsy Traveller, Southeast Asian, etc. And we issued a media press statement about 2 days after the riots, because we called for a public inquiry with a High Court judge, very similar to the Scarman inquiry in 1981, very similar to the Council inquiry also more recently, to be a high-level, non-judgmental perspective in looking at the cause of the riots. Because as you can imagine, it was a complete knee-jerk reaction. And the only way I could describe the response of the media and the politicians, and more particularly the courts and sentencing, I call it retro-racism. That is a moral panic of very similar to Victorian or Cold War imaginations, where the first reaction is we must lock them up no matter what. Why I use the word retro-racism is basically that what's happening in Britain, that the underlying issues around racism, discrimination, as well as poverty, social exclusion, is all around to see. And I think the riots was almost like a mirror to Britain, and saying to Britain, there are something fundamentally and deeply flawed what's happened in society today. It's not just simply about someone nicking a bottle of water or milk or getting a pair of Nikes. It's much deeper than that. The other aspect around the whole aspect of this issue around sentencing, and I'm sure we're going to get some more evidence and people's perspectives on sentencing, is the psychological impact and the emotional impact of being incarcerated. As a national charity, we do a lot of work around mental health, and a lot of work around, particularly, we launched a report quite recently looking at the mental health well-being of children and young people in Britain, particularly from minority community backgrounds. And what is quite clear when we interview young people in Liverpool, London, and also in Wolverhampton about would they use services or what support would they have, one of the key things that came quite clearly was that they lacked confidence in engaging with adults in terms of either using mainstream statutory services unless they felt they had a personal relationship with an individual, maybe a youth worker, a mentor, or someone of a particular faith background who could have some confidence with. And I think my concern is, and one of the key things again that's been skipped over around this whole issue, that yes, a lot of young people were caught up in the riots, but a lot of adults were caught up in the riots, but the way that the media have reinforced the fact that it's all been gangs, it's all been young people, and it's not been the case. There's been no real gang-related activity, as far as I'm aware, connected with the riots, but yet the media have, the first thing, if you can remember, Theresa May said, it's all gang-related. So this adds more to the stereotyping of young people. Now, all young people have been affected by this, but my concern particularly are young people of African, Caribbean, Turkish background who've been caught up in this, because they, from all the evidence that we know, that they will get, and they have been getting stiffer sentences, that's very clear, which feeds into the whole issue of the criminalisation process affecting young people in places like Hackney or Tottenham, and particularly young black men. That's part of the reality. And what does that mean if you're criminalised, you have a criminal record? What's your life chances in terms of employment, education, housing? These are the consequences. You can argue maybe that they shouldn't have got caught up in the situation, but you know, we're not here to kind of analyse individual acts of activity at that time. We're looking at what's the impact, and the impact will mean that you're going to have triple, double discrimination. Even young women and girls who've been caught up in that, actually, they've been given severe custodial sentences, which reinforces the increasing population of women in prisons as well. So I think there are some key things that we need to explore around this issue. But the final point I want to raise, because I think there's an opportunity for us to have more great dialogue. In September of this year, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, every 10 years, the government, the UK government, has to produce a report on what it does around on issues around race equality, community cohesion. All members of the UN organisations that are treated have to do this. The UN officials, not only did they condone what happened in Dale Farm, in terms of treatment by the council there, the Gypsy tribal community. They also raised concerns about the government's approach in basically stereotyping and not looking at the underlying causes of the riots. So I think this is very important. And not only that, they actually raised concerns about the police's approach around stop and search, the use of DNA database, and also concerns about the government's dismantling of race equality policy procedures to give the impression that we're in a post-racial society, which means that race doesn't matter, actually gender doesn't matter, because everyone's equal and everyone's got access to the wealth, like the bankers, haven't they? So there are some fundamental issues that we need to explore, and I think in terms of my fear is actually we've now criminalised a whole generation of young people, and when some of them, I mean, I know there's been 1 or 2 cases where in terms of appeals, the sentences have been reduced, but once you have a criminal record, it's very difficult to try and rebuild your life. There's one case of a young man in Manchester whose sentence was halved, but he's getting weekly counselling in youth custody. Now, when he comes out, what's going to happen to him? He's going to be automatically caught up in the mental system, and that isn't the conversation, which I'm not going to go into right now. But I think the key thing that I'm very concerned about, it's quite clear that the sentencing was politically motivated. It's quite clear there's a moral panic that takes place, and the moral panic is used to justify everything, which makes the life of young people very difficult today.
Hi everyone, my name's Adam. I'm just going to try and give you a very brief overview of what the Tottenham Defence campaign does, why it does it, and what kind of a little bit of information about its approach. I'm kind of glad you brought up the thing about the United Nations Convention Against Racism though as well, because also it's important to remember that Britain didn't actually attend the convention. They refused to attend alongside the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Israel. Might have something to do with indigenous rights, but that's another story. Okay, so the Tottenham Defence campaign was basically a campaign set up to look at the immediate needs of the young people affected by the riots and the aftermath. A lot of people came to the initial meetings with ideas of, some people came because they wanted a socialist revolution, some people came because they wanted to smash the state, some people came because they wanted to have a Pan-Africanist anti-imperialist uprising, which are all very valid points. But we needed to really think about what the immediate needs were. And the immediate needs were an entire generation of young people were going to be criminalised for the rest of their lives if we didn't do something very, very quickly. So the initial meeting was, basically the first thing was to ensure that the entire thing was Tottenham-led. They wanted to make sure that, because in the past SWP people and other kind of groups that people in Tottenham found trying to co-opt some of the campaigns and weren't really interested in the real needs of some of the young people they were trying to represent. So the first thing was that it had to be all Tottenham-led, so people had to kind of say whether they were from Tottenham or not, whether they represented a particular organisation or not, in the way in which they worked. The second thing was that they provided legal training. So they had a panel of 3 or 4 solicitors. We sat there for 2 hours and they basically told us kind of quite basic information, but stuff that we needed to know, and the kind of information that we needed to give to the young people. Stuff about what to do if your house is raided, what to do if you're arrested, what to do if the police ring you up and ask you if you'd like to have a friendly chat with them in the police station, what to do if the police tell you they would like to take a witness statement from you, the final 2 mainly being trickery. And then we set about dividing Tottenham up into different estates. So we just divided the week up. Okay, when you're around in the evenings, when are people around on the weekends. Here are some leaflets with basic information, similar stuff to what we've been learning about raids, about arrests, around stop and search, and then going on and just knocking on doors saying, hi, we're here from the Tottenham Defence campaign. There are likely to be a lot of raids here soon, there are likely to be a lot of arrests here soon. The police are likely to be stopping and searching a lot of people here at the moment. Here's what to do if you're arrested, here's what to do if you're raided, here's what to do if you're stopped. Here are some names of some sympathetic lawyers, here are some contact details of other people who may be of use if you come under police scrutiny for whatever reason. I think that's a kind of ongoing thing that's really, really important. I think that if the police, if the criminal justice system continues the way it's going in terms of putting everyone on trial that they've arrested, the trials are going to be going on for quite a few years. I think. The second thing was that people were going to courthouses. It's very, very difficult in that kind of situation when approaching families, of course, because a lot of them are quite distressed. Some of the young people don't really want to speak to you. They're not really sure who you are. Are you from the Daily Mail? Are you an undercover police officer? There are a whole host of people that you could be who wouldn't be particularly sympathetic to their situation. But that's something that we've been trying to do also. The third thing we've been trying to do, or we've been doing, is training the young people who haven't been arrested. An organisation called Hype, which is Haringey Young People Empowered, did a massive football tournament with loads and loads of football teams, male and female, and provided lunch and stuff. And in between the football matches, they did like kind of workshops on stop and search, workshops on arrest, as well as a big kind of survey as well, to find out what people's kind of experiences were of stop and search, what kind of experiences people were of arrests, police powers, as well as cuts, government, a whole host of things as well. So that's basically what Tottenham Defence Campaign does. It's quite simple, but we think it's quite important. We didn't want to get too bogged down with kind of complications and those kind of things. It's what needs to happen in the immediate future, which is making sure people have the right resources to access when they are arrested, when they are raided, when they are stopped, when they are harassed. If you'd like to keep up with what we're doing, we've got there's a website. If you just search Tottenham Defence Campaign into Google, it's there. I've got some flyers. They're outside. I've also got some on me. They've got, as well as obviously all the contact details, they've got the similar kind of important information: what to do if you're arrested, what to do if you're raided, what to do if you're being stopped and searched. So if anyone has any particular issues of friends, family, colleagues, or what have you who've been affected by this, please do come and speak to me afterwards. And also a number of kind of, as I'm sure you're aware, media outlets do kind of keep people up to date with what Tottenham Defence Campaign and other defence campaigns are doing. I myself write for Ceasefire magazine, so you can also keep up to date with what we're doing there. And that's about it.
Good evening, my name's Kat Craig. I'm a solicitor at Christian Kahn Solicitors. Very briefly, Christian Kahn is a firm that's been around for about 25 years. We represent individuals and communities against the state and try and empower people to hold the state to account when their rights have been abused. We mainly do legal aid work, which means we mainly work with people who can't afford to pay for lawyers privately, but we fundamentally believe that the resources that you have available shouldn't impact on the quality of representation that you receive and your ability to hold state bodies to account. We have lots of different departments, including the criminal defence team, who have been working very hard of late. I personally specialise in actions against the police and inquests arising out of deaths in police and prison custody. And in that context, we do a lot of work in stop and search, challenging stop and search powers, issues that we mentioned in terms of DNA, how that impacts on people's ability to work in the future. Perhaps unsurprisingly, my view as a lawyer is that this isn't really a legal battle. It's not something that we're going to win on a legal front. I think, as always, we should be using the law as one tool in our arsenal of weaponry to hold the state to account. But it's a political struggle, as far as I can see. It's a class struggle, it's a race struggle. I take on board, Patrick, what you're saying, not in a stereotypical way, in the way that communities have been stereotyped in their actions, but in the sense that the inequalities in society have a disproportionate impact on certain sections of society, and those often follow class and race lines. And it was best put by a 13-year-old who I was working with. We do a lot of stop and search, kind of know your rights workshops on the weekends, and he just looked at me and said, not in entirely these terms, but why is there such a discrepancy? Why are MPs being given very, very lenient sentences when they are fleecing the public purse, but these people who are stealing bottles of water are being put in prison? And I honestly couldn't answer, except to say that fundamentally our legal system is corrupt and run by pale, male and stale men. So couldn't answer. He put it a lot better than I did anyway. So, and then, yeah, all the points, and all the points that have been made already by my colleagues on the panel. Why is it that MPs get a voice to explain why, you know, it was really important they got this duck house, but kids are being told that this is gang-related activity when there's no evidence of gang-related activity in that sense. So, and the best example of how abysmal that situation is when I read Ken Clarke, our Justice Secretary's quote, talking about a feral underclass of people rioting, which well, let's leave Ken Clark aside. But on the facts of that, yes, 3/4 of the people who have been arrested had previous convictions, but there was a complete failure to address the issues that underlie that, the fact that people's alternatives have been consistently removed by this government, by the previous government, that certain sections of society are being disproportionately targeted through stop and search, who are being ostracised. The fact that these statistics are probably false statistics as well. If you think about the way that policing works, when they were looking at arresting people, these were local police officers watching CCTV footage, picking out the people that they recognised because they knew that they were going to be easier to target. That's how it worked. It wasn't that these people are entrenched criminals. So there's been no comprehensive analysis about the causes, and I'm sure that people here are able to contribute to that better than I can, and members of the panel have as well. But my analysis is this is yet another occasion where there's been a police shooting of a young black man, yet another occasion where the police have used excuses, have laid the blame with the victim on how that happened, yet another occasion where state authorities have failed to subject themselves to the same scrutiny that every day they want to put members of the public under, where the police are refusing to be policed, where they're refusing to be transparent about it, where there's misinformation, and let's just say I think we'd be forgiven to anticipate some collusion on behalf of the Independent Police Complaints Commission. I wouldn't want to sit higher than that on record. So, I mean, in my line of work, I come in later down the line. I used to do a lot of criminal defence work mainly with young people. Nowadays, it's mainly actions against the police when people have been approached for no reason whatsoever on the street other than that they're black and they're wearing a hoodie, and then the police turn up and they say, "What are you doing?" And someone quite rightly asserts their right, saying, "Why are you stopping me?" And then there's some kind of incident where inevitably my client gets accused of assaulting a police officer, where effectively they're fabricating evidence to cover up their own wrongdoings for racistly approaching some young bloke in the street who's just wandering around. But I do want to touch on the sentencing issues very, very briefly. I'm sure you've all read the quotes from the Manchester judge who said that sentencing guidelines could properly be departed from because the riots were completely outside the usual context of criminality. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's okay to go on the rob in any kind of situation. However, I really think it's worth examining that comment in itself about how the judiciary is looking at this. Is it really that different when people go and burgle somewhere? Is it really that different when people are committing criminal damage? Is it really that different than all the other circumstances where there's a lack of opportunity, where there's a lack of access to resources, where there's an unequal distribution that causes people to commit certain offences? It's not an excuse, but I question the intellectual integrity of the judge in Manchester who said that this was entirely different to all the other circumstances where people commit criminal offences. And you may have noticed I'm slightly sceptical of the judicial system generally, but Court of Appeal judges have now, at least they've recognised, they've said this Manchester judge has effectively gone way beyond his powers and drawn up guidelines that are so detrimental to everybody else with such huge repercussions for the community that those need to be challenged. And I saw a quote from the president of the Prison Governors Association, Ian McLennan Murray, who said that it's a sentencing friendly, and I think when the head of prisons is speaking out about these things, we really do need to ask authorities to take another look at what's going on. And it's putting pressures on prisons. It's something no doubt Andrew will be able to speak about in more detail, and how that impacts people when they do go into prison. And just again, some of those statistics. MOJ statistics, Ministry of Justice statistics, say that between the 6th and the 9th of August this year, 70% of people who were arrested were remanded, i.e. they were put into prison whilst they were either waiting to plead or they were waiting to be found guilty. And that's in contradiction to 10% of people in the same period for the same offences last year. The discrepancy is horrifically apparent. Sentences are twice as long for the similar type of offences. Again, I appreciate, Andrew, I think it's right, there are clearly aggravating features of these offences being committed in the context of riots. But such a big discrepancy, I'm not sure if it's justified and if it can honestly be justified. And 45% of people are getting custodial sentences, whereas previously it was 12%. And the really worrying thing about that as well is that it's a blanket policy. So people aren't looking at individual circumstances, what is going to happen, why are people committing offences, if they are committing offences, what were the circumstances in which that was happening. There was a document leaked It'd been circulated to all investigating officers by Operation Withen, which is Scotland Yard's emergency response to the outbreak of violence in the capital, demonstrating it was an intended policy. The document said that no one arrested in or after the riots should receive a caution. No one should receive a caution, regardless of the circumstances of what happened. So it's a blanket policy. It's a blanket policy without proper thought, proper consideration, and as per usual, no proper consultation. Nobody who's going to be impacted by that policy has been given voice. Nobody who understands about the repercussions of this policy has been asked to consider it. And as a result of that, I think we've seen criminalisation, yet again criminalisation, of people who are effectively manifesting concerns in society. There's an increasing distrust between communities and police. There's a disengagement and there's a disrespect where people believe that, I think it's a long time ago that people believe this now, but people believe that the police should be protecting us and not persecuting us, and we're just further entrenching that difference between communities and police. Just two other things I want to touch on. I don't want to go on too long because I'd much rather have a debate about it, but I think there's been, the police have really piggybacked on the riots, and they've been trying to extend their powers in so many different ways. I don't know if you saw there was a 30-day blanket ban against all protests imposed in 5 boroughs in East London, and one of my long-standing protesting clients came up to me and said, "Can we challenge it?" And we did, and eventually the ban was withdrawn. But they said there's a ban in five East London boroughs because we're worried about what's going to happen after Mark Duggan's funeral. There was no ban in Tottenham, thank God, because goodness knows what would happen with the funeral. But it was just they were piggybacking on something that they were trying to stop people's legitimate right to protest. These were arms fairs and LGBT marches and this kind of stuff, just piggybacking on that. They've imposed a blanket Section 60 power across London under Section 60 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. The police can stop and search people without reasonable grounds for suspicion. So it takes away any kind of accountability. It leaves the police entirely free to target people disproportionately and at will. And there's now a blanket power in place, so anybody can be stopped and searched. So I think, as I said, they're piggybacking on these issues. The final thing that I just wanted to very briefly touch upon, and I'm sure there's room for debate about this, is police accountability in the Independent Police Complaints Commission. And I mean, there's so many examples, I'm sure you know them all. Obviously, Ian Tomlinson's death was a really, really prominent example, which got a lot of press coverage about how the IPCC were not only incompetent, but raised serious questions about their independence and whether they had any teeth and political will to hold the police to account when they transgressed their powers so seriously. And that's something that we encounter in my law every single day. Imagine if they're prepared to do that in a high-profile case where they're being scrutinised by the media and the public. Imagine what they do on a day-to-day level with people who aren't properly represented for less serious, effectively, issues. So we've got a defunct complaint system, and I think that contributes to the breakdown in community relations with the police and our ability to hold the state to account, combined with these very draconian measures, and combined with the fact that the reality is the police are a reactionary body. They will not of their own volition change their policy. They will not of their own volition recognise the mistakes that they have made and try to put policies in place to proactively protect the community, and they will not do that without coercive steps that are being taken by the community, by the media, by all those different places. Different organisations, sorry. So in a nutshell, my view remains that the only thing that we can do is have a community-led organisation that sticks together, where we empower ourselves, we educate ourselves, we share resources, work together with organisations like Stopwatch, work together with Tottenham Defence Campaign, try and support each other, and hopefully we can continue through our legal work to serve and support the community to achieve some kind of accountability.
Hello everyone, my name is Kamaljeet Gill. I'm a research and policy analyst with the Runnymede Trust, and I'm also the administrator for Stopwatch. Stopwatch was set up about a year ago it was inspired by the case that stopped Section 44, the Gillen case, which some of you may have heard of, and mainly out of the frustration that 30 odd years after Scarman we were still having the same debates about stop and search. So Stopwatch has been very interested in the riots and in the aftermath, and I think there's maybe 3 points, I guess, I'd like to make that I think are worth considering. The first, and this has been touched on a bit, is it's not just the people that are being sentenced, but how people are being sentenced. I think we need to look at who's being selected and why. It's already been mentioned that they're going for the usual suspects, and that probably explains this vast disproportionality and this vast overwhelming number of people who already have some level of former criminal record. But I think more importantly than that, it's worth thinking about exactly what kind of damage it's going to do to the communities when the police go in and arrest these people. I think by any standards, the shooting of Mark Duggan must be considered a failed police attempt, regardless of the criminality of Duggan or otherwise. It resulted in him being shot, not being arrested, and never being brought to trial. So if that gives you some indication of the level of tact and discretion and able policing that is being deployed here, well, if the police are marching into communities and snatching people, what's the chances this is just going to provoke further unrest? I think there's another point, which is that this is actually, and this is something that Kat touched on, this isn't just a new thing. I think this is part of a wider trend in the real closing in on people's ability to dissent and protest. We had 2 years ago, we had pro-Palestine protests, which subsequently followed up by young Asian men being snatched from their homes, often in front of their families, and given what must be considered punitive sentences. Then we had the student riots, and right up to the week of the Duggan shooting, there were still students being taken by the police and dragged into the courts, and we had a man who was put in hospital by a police baton with bleeding on the brain, being charged with violent disorder. I think what we're going to see now is we're going to see a similar thing. We're going to see, instead of the police focusing on protecting the community in the event, there's a much stronger focus on retributive, punitive policing, where the police turn up in the community subsequently and they grab people who've been problematic. I think the final point is, and this is something I think needs some research and really does need to be looked at, and it's moving a little bit away from sentencing, is what about all the sort of the responses that are, if you like, extrajudicial and rely on police discretion. I think what we're going to see a lot of is things like fixed penalty notices. We're going to see stringent and obstructionary bail conditions. We're going to see things where the people are kept in the police cell for hours and then they're never brought to court, because bringing people to court, even if the judges are being particularly stringent, is always a little bit chancy. There's always a judicial review, there's chances for appeal. There are people like Kat who can cause problems. But instead what we're going to see is people given bail notices that stop them going into city centres. We're going to see them being, we're going to see much more use of tagging, and we're going to see fixed penalty notices, which basically just dissuade people from going out and engaging in public action again. And I think that's something that we've really got to watch out for as well.
Hello everyone, you all right? My name is Twilight Bay, and I am a mentor in one capacity. But my foundation in this work is as an activist in my community at the age of 17 to end violence in my community and work against police abuse that was taking place in my community in South Central Los Angeles. What I like to say in regards to the sentencing and even just the events that took place, there was a lot of elements of it that reminded me of Los Angeles in 1992. There was a lot of elements of it that reminded me of Los Angeles in 1984. You know, in the years preceding the Olympics. Me and a lot of my peers were arrested simply for wearing colors and put into prison for 6 to 9 months at a time for nothing more than wearing colors and being in an area known to be a gang area. I have a young person that I'm working with currently who was arrested leading up to Carnival. And the police had no reason, really, to arrest him. And even when me and my colleagues went into court to support him, what was clear is that even the judge knew that there was no reason to hold him on remand. But he's still in remand now. And this is before the civil unrest kicked off. So for me, when I see what's taking place here, I do think that it's a systematic approach to eroding the rights of people. I do think it's a understanding that more and more people are fed up with not being able to access the materials and resources that they need to be able to live a respectable life as a human being. And rather than address the underlying issues, the fundamental aspects of how the structure of the society has helped to facilitate those things, it's about locking people up. So when I talked to young people, and we got young people together following the civil unrest, we had this big, massive meeting, and you know, we brought young people together from all four corners of London to discuss it and give them the opportunity to vent. But one of the things I also wanted them to do was to look at some of the things we did in Los Angeles, which was actually to fight to implement legislation that gave the community the power that it needed to address the issues that we were facing, and ask them what was it they really wanted to see happen here. And after that debate, after that forum, one of the things that came out clearly is that, one, they felt that the IPCC had no power, and that the community, there should be some form of community or civilian review board that has the power to investigate and prosecute officers. So that's part of their campaign, something that they're pushing for. Another thing is that they looked at the budget for next year for the UK, which is around $713 billion that the government plans to spend. And they pretty much put together a budget of what they felt would bring about empowerment and provide services for communities and young people, which will cost about 1p on every pound the government plans to spend next year. And so they're preparing that campaign to take that forward as well. So even though I do a lot of work with young people in the context of mentoring, I am very much so dedicated to also teaching them what it means to be an active citizen, and not just the stuff they teach you in PSHE at school. Thank you.